Hi, everybody. It's so dark in here, isn't it romantic? I can't really tell if you guys are all still awake or not. It's so soothing in here. It's a delight to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the work that the State Board is undertaking recently as it relates to the local control funding formula and the local control accountability plan. I want to do a few framing remarks first to get started, and then at the very end, I'm sorry for the way this screen looks, I'm going to show you a video because David told me not to do PowerPoints, and I always follow instructions, but the video has PowerPoints in it, so that's my part of the PowerPoints. I want to start off by talking a little bit about sort of our perspective on accountability from the State Board. And it probably won't be surprising to you all that it's going to be very similar to the things that Deb Sigmund talked about. And it's also, it's not a surprise because the State Board is very purposely working very closely with the Superintendent of Public Instruction. I think most of you in this room, I see you nodding. This is a positive change that we went through many years when we didn't work so well together. And I'm proud to say I'm very privileged to have worked with Deb Sigmund in my role as the executive director and certainly now on the board. And I hope that all of you in the field will feel the change that that makes to have a very coherent approach to accountability. I'm going to do a little bit of naysaying to David's 3 separate models. There's nothing separate about the models that you've heard about today. I hope that what you'll see at the State Board level is us bringing all those things together. That we're really trying to build a coherent accountability model that's a sum of all of its parts. And I think we really have to resist this temptation to try to parse things out and say this is standards-based accountability and this is professional accountability and ours is political accountability, because all of those come together in LCFF and in the LCAP in my view. So I just don't think we want to parse the pieces out or set up any kind of false dichotomies. Deb used the term we're remodeling our accountability system. She actually had a great graphic that showed sort of the history of what we've done in accountability over the last several years. I'd like to call it refocused, repurposed accountability. And I want to talk a little bit, just transition to what the general principles that underlie the local control funding formula and the local control accountability plan, which is the piece that is linked to the funding. For those of you who are Jesuit scholars, it's called the principle of subsidiarity. For those of us who haven't studied that, I call it local engagement, decision-making, and local accountability. Jonathan talked a lot about, and I completely agree with him, and I want to applaud Jonathan for being the public spokesperson on behalf of the failure of NCLB. We are really moving away from the centralized accountability where, whether it's the federal government trying to tell you what to do, which is even more foolhardy than the state trying to tell you what to do, we're trying to acknowledge that the best accountability and the most effective accountability occurs at the local level for the very reasons that Jonathan laid out. Every day in every school in this state, something good is happening. And the ability to make changes, improvements, has to occur locally. And that's what the LCFF and LCAP is about. It also uses varied and hopefully meaningful metrics. You heard a lot in Deb's presentation about the kinds of changes that we're making around the Accountability Performance Index. Jonathan did a fantastic job of laying out the various domains that the core districts are using. And I'm here to tell you that luckily, the Local Control Accountability Plan incorporates virtually all of those metrics that we've heard about today. So again, this notion of coherence. We, with the local control funding formula, also deal with a little important issue, or kind of a small important issue, which is money. And we substantially increase the amount of money that goes to local education agencies. But we also say, and I think this is probably the biggest change, at least in my mind, is that local education agencies must link their resources to their priorities. And they have to do it in a meaningful way. They have to do it with very deep engagement at their local level. And they also have to be willing to hold themselves accountable to it. What this also means is that we finally realized a promise that I think we made in 1999. David didn't mention in my introduction that I worked for Governor Davis when the Public School Accountability Act was put in place. And remember, the Public School Accountability Act created the Academic Performance Index. And the promise we made then was, once we have a great accountability system, we'll get rid of all the inputs. We'll get rid of the rule orientation, the compliance oriented, and instead get out of the school district's ways and say, make the decision, the best decision you know how to make. And I think that just like your promise in 2008, now in 2014, we're on the cusp of being able to make good on that promise, to get away from rule orientation, top-down compliance, and move toward a true outcome-based accountability system. Finally, with respect to the operational side of local control funding formula, it's our job at the state board, and I'll tell you a little bit more about our specific work in a minute, to try to eliminate or minimize, certainly, the redundancy of plans and reports that local school districts are required to do now. For those of you who are in school districts, you know that you have to do a single plan for student achievement. You have to do Title III compliance reports if you're serving English learners, which most all of our school districts are. I could go on and on. But the one thing that one of the things the statute calls on the state board to do is to try to take those reports that are currently required and say, how can you fit that within this local control accountability plan? Avoid the duplication and the redundancy in the reporting and in the identification of priorities. Just to give you an example of some of those that are already there and that we're currently looking at, my all-time favorite is the School Accountability Report Card, or the SARC that you all know. And I'll just do a little bird walk here and say that as we were developing the local control funding formula, we held a series of stakeholder meetings to try to go through these various reports that were already out there. And the School Accountability Report Card is the one that keeps coming up. And for those of you who don't remember, it was established in 1998. It, believe it or not, was part of the Proposition 98 initiative, which is why we'll never do away with it, because we'd have to go back to the voters to get rid of the School Accountability Report Card. So my position always is, let's embrace the School Accountability Report Card. It's here to stay. We found, my friend Carrie Ashley here, who has to put together the SARC template every year for the state board, that there have been 10 separate pieces of legislation that have amended the School Accountability Report Card over that period of time and added all kinds of additional reporting requirements. Well, again, fortunately, when you look at the requirements, you're going to see that they're very similar to what's being asked for in the Local Control Accountability Plan. So we've had for a number of years, despite what some folks thought, a pretty meaningful and wide-ranging accountability system if you were willing to look at metrics other than the API. So the School Accountability Report Card requires all the academic performance that you would normally think about, the API, adequate yearly progress. There's lots of information about teacher qualification and experience, curriculum and course offerings, college-going rates, career technical education. All of those things are on the SARC already. So we will be building on the SARC as we start to build out the local control accountability plan template. School districts are also required to do annual audits. That requirement's been around almost as long as SARC. Probably was put in place when we put our annual budget process in place. It's known as AB 1200. And the annual audits have a lot of additional information that's very financial oriented or process oriented. What's your attendance rates? What are your teacher assignments? What is your instructional time? What's your administrator to teacher ratios? So all of those metrics will continue to be in place as we implement the local control formula. There are all kinds of other federal requirements I already mentioned. And then the other state processes that many of you are familiar with are the so-called Williams requirements, which were put in place several years ago by a lawsuit that the ACLU brought against the state. And those have to do with the availability of instructional materials, the quality of school facilities, and also teacher assignment. So those are all still in place. And our goal here in local control is to try to bring those all together, again, in a meaningful way, and in a way that creates a meaningful stakeholder input and has school districts say, we have to do all those things. We're going to do them in the context of what our academic priorities are, some of the things that Jonathan laid out. But more fundamentally, we're also going to take new money that we have, all the funding that we have, and say, how does that work? How does that attach to these priorities? How are we going to invest in our students in order to get the kind of outcomes that we expect. The other thing I just want to mention is that as we move to this repurposed or refined accountability system, that I hope we'll all keep in mind comments that Meryl Barbeau, who you're going to hear from in a little while, made recently in a commentary in EdSource, which I thought was fantastic, by the way, Meryl. But that districts they're very complex systems. Jonathan did a good job of describing that. All of the decisions that are made at districts have to be interconnected. And as I've already said a number of times, and the resources that are going to be directed towards those interconnections and the priorities have to be identified, and they have to be tracked on a regular basis. So again, just to reinforce what the general principles of the LCFF are: local engagement, decision-making, accountability at the local level, and that accountability has to be much more broad-based. Jonathan was very eloquent in talking about the non-cognitive domains, and that we haven't paid a lot of attention to in the past, and we think it's time to do that in addition to the academic domains. We also believe strongly in flexibility and allocation of resources. The local control funding formula will bring in about 18 billion, I have a million on here, but it's B with a billion, over 8 years to school districts, largely as a result of the new funding that was made possible through Proposition 30. The funding, the new funding system is transparent. It's very simple to understand. There's a base grant, and districts that serve English learners or students who are poor or foster youth get additional funding, much easier to understand. And again, accountability is really rooted at the local level. It's rooted at the local governing board level, and that the academic priorities are backed up by resource allocations. So specifically, the local control funding formula identifies 8 state priorities. They're very similar to the ones that actually Jonathan laid out. I think you saw that in his slide. And in this little video, you'll hear more about the specific priorities. But they're ones that you would certainly expect: academic priorities, the non-cognitive priorities having to do with suspension and expulsion, school climate. There are many priorities related to English learners to make sure that English learners receive appropriate academic instruction and are able to move into full proficiency in English. We at the state board level, we are actively involved in soliciting public input right now. We've had a series of regional forums. They're continuing with the help of the California Endowment to get additional parent input. At every one of our board meetings, we're soliciting input about implementation. We're required to do 3 things in the next couple of years. Develop regulations having to do with spending to make sure that districts are spending the funds that they get on behalf of the students most in need, to improve or increase services. We're working on those regulations now, and those will be done in January. We're also required to develop this template, the Local Control Accountability Plan template, by March of next year, and that's part of our active solicitation for advice about that. And again, we're trying to do that in a way that minimizes all of these other requirements that I mentioned to you. The last work that we're expected to do is develop what are called evaluation rubrics, and this occurs in a couple of years, October of 2015, by which the state can identify what school districts that might be having a difficult time in meeting their local priorities, or and also to provide technical assistance to them. And that will be done through an entity that was just recently signed into law called the California Collaborative. And this will function, I think, very similarly to the kinds of approach that Jonathan laid out in the core waiver. This is what I would call the professional accountability, that instead of the state being the hammer, if you will, coming in and telling every district, here's what you should be doing, the state will be a partner with local education agencies to identify the technical assistance needs and to try to deploy the professionals who best know how to make that happen at a local level. But the work of the collaborative is just now getting underway, and again, that will happen in a couple of years. So I just wanted to mention that to you. So now I'm going to just show you, before I start this video, I should tell you that we have contracted with WestEd, and the Comprehensive Center at WestEd has provided us with tremendous resources that are all available publicly. They've developed what's called the LCFF channel, And they have a series of videos, little episodes on various parts of the local control funding formula and the local control accountability plan specifically. And I'm going to show you that video. It's only about 5 minutes. But I wanted to do this both as a pitch to you so that you know that it's there, and also because I think this is a nice summary of all the parts that I described briefly.
Welcome to the California State Board of Education's LCFF channel. The video and audio downloads available on the LCFF channel are designed to help the education community learn about how the local control funding formula works to support local implementation activities. The focus of this brief segment is on the Local Control Accountability Plan and the LCFF state priorities. Complementing the changes to state funding made by the Local Control Funding Formula is a newly required Local Control Accountability Plan. The LCAP is LCFF's vehicle for transparency and engagement. It's the way that LEAs are expected to share performance data, needs, actions, and anticipated outcomes that guide the use of available LCFF funding. Before the start of the 2014-15 school year, all LEAs will need to have in place a local control accountability plan prior to the adoption of their budget. State Board of Education approved templates will be available prior to March 2014. However, the LCFF legislation provides important details about the LCAP that LEAs would be well served to think about now. Let's start with what should be included in the LCAP. According to Education Code Section 52060, the LCAP must describe for each LEA and each school within the LEA the annual goals for all students, including calling out details for low-income, English learners, and foster youth that address state and local priorities. The LCAP must also describe the specific actions that the LEA will take to achieve the goals it has identified, with budget details that show the level and type of expenditures made to support these actions. The state priorities are expressed as metrics for which LEAs are expected to develop performance measures to demonstrate how LCFF and the LCAP support student outcomes. The state priorities include demonstrating compliance with Williams requirements. This includes reporting appropriate teacher assignment, sufficient instructional materials, and facilities in good repair. Implementation of the academic content and performance standards adopted by the State Board of Education, including how the programs and services will enable English learners to access the Common Core academic content standards and the English language development standards. Parental involvement, including efforts the school district makes to seek parent input in making decisions for the school district and each individual school site, and including how the school district will promote parental participation in programs for economically disadvantaged pupils, English learners, foster youth, and individuals with exceptional needs. Pupil achievement, as measured by multiple indicators, including but not limited to assessment data, college readiness, and language proficiency. Pupil engagement, as measured by multiple indicators, including but not limited to rates associated with attendance, chronic absenteeism, dropout rates for both middle and high school graduation. School climate, as measured by multiple indicators including, but not limited to, pupil suspension and expulsion rates, as well as other local measures assessing safety and school connectedness. The extent to which pupils have access to and are enrolled in a broad course of study that includes core subject areas, for example, English, mathematics, social science, science, visual and performing arts, health, physical education, and career and technical education, including the programs and services developed and provided to economically disadvantaged pupils, English learners, foster youth, and individuals with exceptional needs. And pupil outcomes, if available, in the subject areas comprising a broad course of study. Engagement of a broad group of LEA stakeholders is expected in the development of the LCAP. Specifically, the LCFF legislation calls for governing boards to consult with teachers, principals, administrators, other school personnel, parents, and students to develop the LCAP. In fact, before the LCAP is presented to the governing board, the LCAP must be presented to a general parent advisory committee that includes parents, guardians, and students within the low-income, English learner, and foster youth. And in cases where 15% or more of the students are English learners, and there are at least 50 English learners, a special English Learner Parent Advisory Committee is also required. Should the advisory groups have comments, the superintendent must respond to comments in writing. While there will be unique templates to capture the LCAP information, much of the information required to complete the LCAP resembles the type of information included in local educational agency plans, school accountability report cards, and single plans for education. As is the case with these other types of plans, good planning processes will yield good plans, and this remains true with the LCAP. Now is the time to begin thinking about how goals and student needs are defined in alignment with state priority metrics for the LCAP and other plans managed by the LEA. Thank you for viewing this edition of the LCFF Channel's Implementation Insight. More information can be found at lcff.wested.org and at www.cde.ca.gov.
So I wanted to obviously put in a plug for this. I think it's a very helpful tool. It's available to anybody who's making presentations, particularly if you're doing it at your local school boards. And it's kind of pitched at a level for people who are not as familiar as some of us might be with this topic. This is one of 6 episodes, so if you go to WestEd's website, you'll see the other episodes that are on there. And I think they're very, very helpful for helping people understand the work. I also want to put a plug into the department's website. There are many, many resources on the department's website having to do with implementation of LCFF. And finally, if you have anything you want to share with the state board about implementation, we are looking for that input. And you can also do that online, either at the department or at WestEd. So thank you very much.